Welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Women's Safety in India, the Past, Present and Future. This is a public policy webinar presented by undergraduate students and is going to be a discussion on historical and contemporary shifts in India's law pertaining to women's safety. In the discussion today, we have Professor Juhi Siddharth, who is an associate professor of gender studies and public policy at Flame University, as well as three students, Kabir Dev, Neha Ramesh, and Yash Goyal. Each student shall be discussing a particular aspect relating to today's topic, and will then also be answering any questions that might arise on the topic and having a discussion between them. And with that, Kabir, we'll start with you.
All right, thank you. So I'll begin by setting a context for the state of women in India today. So in order to fully comprehend the state of women in the context of law, it is really important to understand the historical background of different legal texts even before the Indian Constitution was even conceptualized, such as the Manusmriti, the different Veds. So that sets a context of what the state of women were in that time and how far we've evolved or not through the ages. So this very ingrained nature of sexual harassment, which has existed all throughout, and the very even normalization of it in Indian society, can be traced right back to the Indian society during the Vedic ages. I'll give an example of a couplet of the famous Hindi poet Tulsi Das, who had described the status of women in his writings in the following manner: that Thor, Gawar, Shudra or Nari, ye sab taran ke adhikari, which in its very literal translation means that animals, illiterates, untouchables, and females deserve to be actually punished and rebuked. So this situation since then has changed to a great extent, if one can say so, and Indian lawmakers in the Indian courts have played a very significant role in this particular change. Although apart from such snippets, the very malicious content and tenets of ancient texts like Manusmriti, which has been castigated on the whole for its extremely derogatory and demeaning language regarding women as well as other minorities, India has evolved to a great extent in the sense that in codifying laws and in advancing and empowering women in a sense. While with the beginning with the medieval period in India, with the advent of Mughal rule, this period, which lasted for almost 500 years, saw a grave change and curtailment of women's rights in India. Although there were a few leading ladies of this era, such as Razia Sultan, Noor Jahan, Jahan Ara, and other different personalities, the status of women didn't change on the whole altogether. This situation actually started improving of sorts after the Britishers arrived in India and made several changes to the social structure of India. And these very changes, these reforms with regards to the abolition of sati, however, were also met with immense backlash and indignation amongst orthodox religious sections. Like right from sati to even the subsequent backlash against Dr. Ambedkar's planned codification of Hindu laws regarding property, widow remarriage, and so on, were met with immense furor among the conventionally orthodox members of religious communities. Moving on to the post-independent changes and developments regarding law, gender equality has, in a sense, always been an elusive concept in history, which has been saddled with impediments of very narrow-mindedness of societal members, which have almost taken a very fiendish delight in suppressing women's rights. And in that sense, even the judiciary has remained oblivious or ambiguous to the rights of women. I will be examining two landmark judgments of the judiciary and examining the role the courts played in these particular cases. Firstly, with the Mathura rape case, which was titled the Tukaram versus State of Maharashtra, which is particularly infamous for the criticism and rebuke it received for its legal fallacies and as well as interpretation of law, as well as the inherently sexist tones that were used by bench members during the trial. While the Mathura rape case of 1972, which was an episode of custodial rape revolving around a tribal girl who was raped by two police constables in the Desai Ganj police station. The Sessions Court, initially in a particularly unnerving judgment, held that the police constables were not liable as there was consensual sexual intercourse because Mathura had been habituated to sexual intercourse at that time. In the appeal, the High Court held the police constables liable and penalized the constables for 1 and 5 years respectively. However, unfortunately, the Supreme Court overturned this very decision of the High Court, reiterating the argument of the Session Court in turn about the consensual sexual intercourse allegedly involved. Furthermore, no marks of physical injury and no cry for help by Mathura concreted these very assertions. The Supreme Court subsequently was severely castigated for not interpreting and visualizing the sheer trauma of a young girl in custody who was sexually assaulted by constables who were in position of authority. Furthermore, the apex court categorized sexual intercourse between the powerless young girl and two well-built constables as a very peaceful affair of sorts. This criticism received by the judgment legally as well as socially through protests and various letters to the CGI led to reforms in rape laws as well, and subsequently the Criminal Amendment Act of 1983. The aftermath of the Mathura case highlighted the need for a legislation which is sensitive to the victims at that time. These developments led to the amendments brought under the Indian Penal Code as well as the Indian Evidence Act. Section 376A to D were added under the IPC, which recognized custodial rape as a punishable offense along with other provisions. Furthermore, a clause to protect women who are of unsound mind and intoxicators are also added, while Section 114A was added in the Indian Evidence Act. It led to the abolishment of publication of victims' identities in rape cases. Secondly, in 1997, India's women celebrated, and as well as men, of course, celebrated a landmark moment when the Supreme Court formulated the Vishaka guidelines that had made it mandatory for institutions across the country to put in place measures to prevent and redress sexual harassment in the workplace. The Vishaka guidelines laid the foundation for the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition, as well as Redressal Act of 2013. The movement that pushed for these very mechanisms has can trace its origins in the sexual harassment and gang rape of Banwari Devi, a Dalit woman who had been employed by the Rajasthan government's Women Development Program. As a Sathin, as workers in the program at that time were called, it was Devi's job to spread awareness about hygiene, family planning, and the necessity of educating girls, along with campaigning against female feticide and then infanticide, dowry, and child marriages. While harassed in the course of her work, Devi was raped gruesomely by 5 Gujar men as punishment in 1992 for stopping the wedding of a 9-month-old Gujar girl at that time. A nationwide network of women's organizations decided to support Banwari Devi's fight for justice, which were led by groups in Rajasthan. The movement recognized that Devi had been attacked at what was essentially her workplace. In the absence of a law that tackled such harassment, 4 women's organizations filed a writ petition in the Supreme Court asking for guidelines that would help institutions recognize, prevent, as well as redress sexual harassment in the workplace. These groups are Vishaka and Women's Rehabilitation Group from Rajasthan and Jagori and Kali for women from Delhi. The guidelines came to be known in common parlance as the Vishaka Guidelines, since that Feminist Women's Collective was the first party listed on the petition itself. Thank you. And now Yash will go forward with the presentation.
Professor Juhi, do you have some comments to put forth?
Yes, thank you, Kabir. So, as he laid out, there were these 2 key cases that happened in post-independence India. Both of them involve women from marginalized communities. The Mathura rape case, of course, was the rape in custody of a Adivasi girl, and which it went to the Sessions Court, then the High Court, and then the Supreme Court, and led to the first significant change in the law regarding law related to rape in the country. And then, of course, so the legal change is of significance in our country, because it was for the first time that it was felt that, rape could also happen in custody, right? And that it has to be recognized by the courts. And the other interesting issue about the Mathura rape case, of course, is that there was in the Sessions Court judgment, it reflected, what the judges were saying reflected a bias against the Adivasi community. The sexual mores in the Adivasi community have always been very liberal, right? And that was used as a weapon against this young girl, a victim, that if in your community, young men and women are mingling before marriage and they are free with their sexuality. So, it couldn't have been that she was raped in the custody because she was used to sexual intercourse. So this is very significant in the sense that Sessions Court the judgment reflected this kind of a bias, which didn't exist, of course, only among judges, but it exists in the wider society as well, among elites and even educated people. The other interesting thing about the Mathura rape case was that, several privileged lawyers, including Upendra Bakshi, they wrote a letter to the president saying that, how could these police constables be acquitted in a case like that? right? And that something had to be done about it. So this is interesting in the sense that whenever there's a crime like this, what matters in terms of helping the victim is that for people, both men and women, and of all classes, to come together to fight for justice, right? It cannot be left just, on that community, that it's happened to that community or the girl from that community, so let them fight for it. But it has to lead to a wider movement, right? And someone like Urvashi Butalia, who is a very well recognized feminist in our country, has said that in India, in fact, post Mathura protests that happened in the country are more like a first wave of feminist movement in India, right? Because it brought together men and women from different places, different classes, religions, and so on. And of course, then the second big change in the legal sphere, which is for the first time you had something called the Vishaka guidelines, uh, addressing sexual harassment at workplace. So before 1997, it wasn't there at all. You just had, the rape law, and you had something called outraging the modesty of a woman. It's in Indian Penal Code, but a specific law dealing with sexual harassment issues at workplace, that happened, or that came into place again in this case also. The woman in question was one from a marginalized community, a Dalit woman, right? Bhavari Devi from Rajasthan. She was doing her duty. It was her job to stop child marriage in these villages. And while she was out working, she was gang raped, right? And she still hasn't received justice. So this case, the Bhavri Devi case, of course, led to the Vishaka guidelines. And then over a period of time, we now have an act called Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, right? Prevention of Sexual Harassment at the Workplace. So this came into force in 2013. It's as recent as that, right? And it's only after that that, you have, the law makes it mandatory for workplaces, for organizations, for companies to have something called the ICC, which is the Internal Complaints Committee, right? Anybody facing sexual harassment at the workplace can approach that committee, right? We'll discuss about what are the problems with that as well, but at least we have something like that. And we must not forget that, it is these landmark cases which brought about these changes in law now, and these changes in law and now, of course, are benefiting a range of women everywhere, right? So now Yash is going to continue and take it from here.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Kabir. As Kabir deliberated upon the rich history of women's social status in India and the rights and laws safeguarding them from violence, one particularly historic one that I would like to focus on is the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013. And I want to highlight how certain sanctions and condemnations by certain entities and international bodies propelled state accountability. And it made the state apparatus take certain courses of action which were unprecedented. So it's the 2012 Nirbhaya case which actually acted as a catalyst that swung state institutions into action, primarily because the incident generated international coverage and was condemned by a United Nations body. And it was the United Nations entity for gender equality and the empowerment of women who called upon the government of India and the government of Delhi, and I quote, they said that it needs to do everything in its power to take up radical reforms, ensure justice, and reach out with robust public services to make women's lives more safe and secure. So the kind of politics that's also espoused by powerful political parties and the stance of civil society organizations like the women's groups, the child rights groups, and the several NGOs having access to governmental ministries, they determine the consequent laws which get enacted or repealed. Uh, but it is primarily international as well as public pressures which drives change forward instead of the ideal commitment that one may expect from certain center and state elites. So during the aftermath of the 2012 Nirbhaya case, it's important to note how it was the Indian National Congress which was in power at that point of time, and the age of consent for sexual intercourse was 18 under the Indian Penal Code. But the criminal law ordinance, which was passed in February 2013, uh, it did not really get passed due to the gruesome crime, but it was primarily due to the protests as well as condemnation from international bodies, and the intricacies which led to change uh, actually mention that it's the Justice Verma Committee which was constituted by the government at that point of time to look into creating a report for making new for making certain sexual offenses uh, amounting to jail time. So uh, the ordinance which was passed in 2013 actually uh, digressed a bit from what the Justice Verma Committee had in place. And just to highlight what an ordinance is, ordinances are laws that are promulgated by the President of India on the recommendation of the Union Cabinet. And it has the same effect as an act of parliament, which enables the government to take immediate legislative action. So through the ordinance, the government sought to reduce the age of consent to 16 years of age. And it was the opposition party at that time, BJP, in 2013, which opposed it by saying that it attacks Indian culture and it shows that it does not consider a girl lesser than the age of 18 as an agential person. And it was paradoxical how there was an internal schism being formed between the Ministry of Law at that time and the Ministry of uh, Women and Child Development. So the head of the the head of the Ministry of Women actually said that lowering the age of consent to 16 will increase child marriages, and child rights groups condemned that lowering the age of consent would increase the risk of child trafficking. So ultimately, from certain backlash received for this ordinance, the government had to increase the age of consent from 16 to 18, which is still not a very progressive reform, but uh, the 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 main features of this new Criminal Law Amendment Act were mainly the fact that it brought about many sexual offenses like stalking, voyeurism, and sexual harassment as proper crimes, which would have a different uh, penalty, whereas before it was different. So all of those also explicitly were for the protection of women, which was a new change in the Indian law. And according to the then law minister, Ashwini Kumar, only 90% of the suggestions offered by the Justice Verma Committee were incorporated in the ordinance. So the ordinance also received a few criticisms from civil society groups, talking about the fact that marital rape was still not constituted as an offense. And today, the sad reality is that rape is still not legally recognized as a crime in India. Another prescient connection that the report drafters of the Justice Verma Committee made was with the AFSPA, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which grants the Indian Army impunity for certain crimes that they perpetrate under the garb of the security of the country. So when it comes to the rape of women, which has happened in Kashmir due to acts like AFSPA ruling there, the AFSPA was also suggested to have certain amendments in it by the Justice Verma Committee, which were ultimately rejected by the government and the president. So uh, this shows that ultimately uh, it's this conflict among different policy actors which ends up defining and determining the course of a law being promulgated. The many positives that are there to this bill was, first of all, how it widened the ambit of criminalizing certain sexual offenses, and the report was quite comprehensive and progressive compared to earlier times. So the definition of rape was also widened as per the amendment bill, as now any amount of penetration would directly constitute rape, whereas earlier it was only vaginal penetration from the penis which was considered rape. But this time there were these solid changes which kind of became more justiciable for women in India? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, so this is interesting. Now, Kabir began with those two cases in history, the Bhavri Devi case and the Mathura rape case, and now Yash has of course spoken about the more recent case, which everybody knows about, the Nirbhaya case, which happened in 2012, and which led to such swift changes in the law, right? Because of the uh, mass movement that happened in the country, right? Something that the country hadn't seen in a long time, where everybody actually came together. And interestingly, a lot of men also joined the movement, to fight for or to raise their voice against sexual assault and rape of women. And Justice Verma Committee, that's an interesting committee formed of people, including lawyers, scholars, a range of people working on gender justice, right? And they invited suggestions from the public, so many people wrote with the suggestions about how the law can be changed and so on. It was a very comprehensive report which also included marital rape, but that hasn't been yet criminalized in our country. There are lawyers even today fighting to get it criminalized. Karuna Nandi is one of them. But to speak about some of the positive changes which were brought about was, as Yash was mentioning, different kinds of crimes have been included in the ambit of the law, right? Which is stalking and also acid attacks, right? So for instance, in acid attacks, very interesting. Even the sale of acid in a chemist, by a chemist, has been criminalized, right? So you can also complain that, a chemist has sold acid, and that person could also be punished. Punishable, that's also a crime, a punishable crime. And in addition to these very important changes in law, a range of other things have happened in the country. For instance, in North India, you have now police stations which are completely filled with women police officers, right? Now, of course, it's debatable that whether a police station full of women police officers, does it encourage women to approach those police officers and file a complaint, or are these police officers also expressing patriarchal attitudes? It's a debatable topic, but this is an experiment that has been tried. Even today, what lawyers are talking about, when it comes to sexual harassment cases or rape cases, is that what is needed, and this has also been documented by Amnesty International, that what is needed actually is the first point of contact between the victim and the state, right? So when a woman who has been raped, when she first approaches the police station, what is needed is for her complaint to be taken seriously and an FIR to be lodged, right? Now, it is here that what you find that, the law in India is not equal for everybody, right? When the police officers see a woman who looks like she's from a poor family, right, they are very likely to dismiss her and not take her complaint seriously at all, right? Compared to a woman who looks like she's from a privileged family, right? This is where uh, what we need is an overhaul of our society, right? Where we ensure that the law is equal for everybody, that if a woman, any woman from any religion, caste, class, when she approaches a police station with a complaint, it has to be taken seriously and there has to be a fair investigation. That is what is needed, right? Very often what happens is the whole discourse around rape cases becomes about, giving death penalty to the rapists, right? But I mean, as somebody, like a lawyer like Rebecca John, the one who fought for Priya Ramani, she said that this is a very tricky thing, because when you raise the punishment, right? If you make the punishment stricter, you have to present a lot of proof in court. Okay, and oftentimes that much of proof is not there, right? And if that much of proof is not there, then the perpetrator is going to be acquitted. So what is needed is not a stricter punishment, but what is needed is swift punishment. That the punishment is definitely ensured, even if there's a sexual harassment and a woman approaches the court. right? People, perpetrators should not feel like, oh yes, I did this, but the case will drag on and on for 20 years, 25 years. I can continue living my life. I'll be out on bail. This is what allows people to commit more crimes, because they feel they can get away. So this is where your change in the state institutions is needed. That punishment is guaranteed, not necessarily that has to be death as a punishment, but even if the punishment is 10 years in the jail or 15 years in the jail, um, everyone in society should feel that one cannot get away. We will not be able to get away, right? And that is what is needed in our society right now. Okay, now we'll move to Neha Ramesh, who's going to focus on a few different things related to sexual harassment and women's safety.
Right, thank you, Ms. Dewey. Also, you really rightly pointed out exactly the direction we should be moving in, which is swifter punishment, not harsher punishment, is a very popular opinion, because there are a lot of comments about how implementing the death penalty actually resulted in rapists killing their victims so that they wouldn't be caught at all, and it wasn't the most efficient way to stop rape as such. So when we talk about policy, it does revolve a lot around formulation and implementation, but it also requires heavy evaluation for prospective policies. Yashin Kabir provided a really solid and technical foundation of the past and current happenings uh, to law and women's safety, but it's also important to gauge how India must move ahead in terms of empowerment as well as protection. So this discourse on prospective policies is very elaborate, and there are points that I may be unable to cover, but I've chosen some really important clauses that India is planning to and that they should focus on. While researching for this very talk, I watched around 20 plus interviews of by individuals such as Flavia Agnes, Karuna Nandi, and a lot of National Commission for Women chairmen. And it's interesting to see how such influential actors, policy actors, and judicial actors highlight how there is no dearth of existing women's laws as such after the 2018 amendment, but rather it's the implementation, the lack of acknowledgement, regressive mindset of India that is decreasing the magnitude and effect of these judicial processes and its offered remedies. I believe when we address prospective policies in this area, it is important to note that 93% of juvenile sexual violence cases occur in their homes by trusted individuals and caregivers. And today's policies and laws are centered in punishing the perpetrator, but it is also facile in a sense that it pays less attention to victim-centric policies. So there is a dire need for rehabilitation, monetary compensation, shelter, and public education about the needs as well as the opportunities a victim has after the case has been pursued. Another change and addition to the Criminal Amendment Act needs to be acknowledging marital rape. The absence of this acknowledgement actually has a lot of implications, not just for married women, but for anyone who has been a victim of sexual violence. That is, that a home is a safe place and no crimes are perpetuated by family members. But we know that the statistics is around 93% just for children, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. As I conclude this first point, it is also paramount to note that in many such cases, the victim is unaware that he or she is even being abused. And this is where education plays an important role. We often rely on the family as a unit to offer primary socialization. But in this case, the family is the toxic environment that the individual is in. And therefore, the formal education sector needs to take up the responsibility of educating children and students with subjects such as sex education and health education. I think one of the largest pushbacks that the national education policy did face with its amendment was that it did not include education, and this is a systematic change that India needs to see in order to one efficiently socialize as well as sort of diffuse gender diminishing cultural norms, which is extremely important. Post 2013, we did see India did see a rising number of complaints and complaints against sexual offenders. This was because of the Justice Verma Committee's suggestion of including punishment for personnel that did not file any complaints for sexual offenses. As disheartening as it was to see sexual offenses going up, it also shows the trust amidst citizens to actually approach the police. But to maintain and ensure individuals continue feeling comfortable to approach the police, it is vital that personnel are selected not on the basis of muscle, but also bounded duty and ability to execute these duties constitutionally. While researching for this talk, I sort of come across an anecdote by the DGP of Maharashtra, PK Jain's interview, where he came across a constable consoling a woman, and when he walked up, she left right after, and when he went up to the constable and asked what happened, he narrated that she had faced some sexual advances from her brother. So he asked why he hadn't filed a complaint for her, and he said I told her to go ask for an apology and move on, considering it's only her brother. So this sort of clearly shows how there are police personnel that are conditioned with this just settle it attitude, and they take the role of the judge and the jury. And this is extremely detrimental and must be corrected by introduction of mandatory training and clear de-emphasis on instructions to report crimes against women. On the topic of judges, recently our very own Chief Justice asked if a sexual offender would marry his victim. And this statement has had and is going to see implications on our society at large. And one of the implementations could possibly be the loss in trust of our judicial system. And it's also interesting to think if women, and by women here I mean women in urban settings, would actually take and resort even to the Me Too movement instead of actual judicial processes. I link this to policy, as it will be a shift from state policies to organizations taking the responsibility to strengthen their internal committee policies and investigative techniques, and because there's no judicial intervention as such. I think to conclude, I'd say a shift from negative liberty to positive liberty is highly needed. That is, instead of saying women should go for self-defense classes and not go out past sundown, there must be policies that facilitate women's reclamation of public space. There should also be education and sensitization of men. I truly believe that sensitizing and mobilizing men into the feminist movement can truly speed the process of cultural transformation. As a country, we also need to desperately weigh in on systematic change that is changing cultural norms and traditions via education, while simultaneously implementing technical methods such as introducing CCTV cameras or having street lights, or even introducing panic button in public transport. But to completely end this, I personally feel grateful to see my generation viewing and debating protection of women as a way to justify loss of autonomy. And I believe that this debate and this discourse will truly pave an ideological shift that is needed in today's policy formulation in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. I think Neha brought up some very interesting points. Firstly, that in a lot of sexual harassment, sexual assault cases, the victim knows the perpetrator, right? It happens in the context of relationships, it happens in families. And very often it's just swept under the carpet. This is where, I think we need more awareness and sensitivity where, you know, if a girl is going up to her mother and complaining about it, that complaint should be taken seriously, right? Very often in the name of, you know, preserving the honor of the family, everyone is asked to be quiet about it, right? This is a big problem. And feminist lawyers and organizations working with victims of sexual abuse, particularly younger people below 18, have come across so many of such cases where, you know, they do not wish to press charges, right? They do not wish to go to police because of this reason. Having said that, though, it has to be also acknowledged that when it comes to sexual harassment at workplace, the Me Too movement, which is a very recent phenomenon, which started in the US and spread across the world, it has opened up one more forum for women to talk about their experiences, right? And this is important because there are women who are not necessarily wanting to send the perpetrator to prison, but all they are looking for is for their story to be out in the open, to to express what they've gone through, right? And then to sort of get some sort of a support and solidarity from other women and men, right? Very often they're looking for that. And in that sense, it has to be acknowledged that, you know, the Me Too movement has, although it hasn't spread to smaller towns and among lower middle classes, but even as far as it has, you know, been talked about and discussed in big cities in India, it has played a big role in exposing some really powerful men who have gotten away with sexual harassment for decades, right? We know this recently from the MJ Akbar case, right? Where so many women came forward and talked about it, right? And the irony was that he actually filed a defamation case against the accuser, Priya Ramani. And of course, he did not win the case, but and the judgment was very important because the judge over there said that, you know, the women can speak about it after many years as well. It's not necessary that you have to speak about sexual harassment only when it happens, because oftentimes young women are so shocked that something like that has happened to them, and, you know, they are scared about several other things, about how, what, you know, the family will say, whether they'll get support or not. So they do not, for a variety of reasons, they do not speak up at that time. But the freedom to speak up about it even many years later should be there. And that is what the Me Too movement has shown us. The other positive fallout of the Me Too movement, in my opinion, is that young women, okay, who are now going to enter the workforce in the coming years, are going to face a better working environment, right? Because there's more conversation around what is the appropriate thing to say, what is inappropriate, right? And greater awareness among men also. There's a lot of self-reflection among men, you know, regarding this, that, you know, okay, probably what I said was sexist, right? And interesting stories of men who've called up, you know, their female friends and apologized, right? Those stories also are there, and this shows us that there's greater awareness, there's greater willingness to own up to one's actions if it has hurt the other person. So just to connect all this, you know, how does, we are all in public policy, how does all this connect to public policy, right? Public policy is something that governments do, okay, about problems that are affecting the society, right? They could be problems related to price rise, unemployment, security, clean air, right? Better roads, and even issues like better education, better housing, and something like women's safety, children's safety, right? This is where, government and people involved, several actors, several stakeholders, your lawmakers, your civil servants, your police officers, your doctors, everybody who's involved or part of the state, right, can play a role in firstly formulating better policies and better laws, and then the next level or the next step is to implement those policies and laws, right? In India, we often say that we have good laws. Actually, we have many good laws, but the problem lies with implementation in a range of areas, right? And that's where we need better governance, right? Better people entering our bureaucracy, right? People who are committed to public service, right? That's one thing. And media, right? I mean, as somebody, if you're interested in public policy, you can also be a part of media and highlight issues that are directly concerning the public and people, right? I mean, we saw this, right? The whole uproar after the Hathras incident, right? The rape of that young girl, right? It was highlighted consistently for a few days by mainstream media, right? Your television channels, your social media, and then there was an uproar about it, and there was pressure on government to, launch an investigation, right? So media plays a big role, and if you're interested in public policy, you can also um, you know, um, be a journalist and cover issues which concern public policy, right? You can be a part of a think tank, you can be a part of a bureaucracy, you can be an academic and do research on these issues, right? You can you can become a lawyer, right? And law and public policy go very well together. Economics and public policy go very well together as combinations. Flame University offers these different majors. In fact, Flame is the only university in the country which is offering public policy at the undergraduate level, right? You won't find this in any other place in India. There are some universities in the US which offer public policy at the undergrad level, but usually it's offered at the master's level. But at Flame, you can do it at the undergrad level. You can, combine it with another minor in economics or international studies or sociology or even business, right? And then get a better idea of what kind of a career you want. If, in short, I'll say that if you're interested, in improving the society that we are living in, doesn't matter the issue, right? You could be interested in environment, you could be interested in gender, you could be interested in health, but if you're interested in improving the lives of the people around you and your own life, right, public policy enters that area, right? Because governments can play a big role in ensuring that, whether it comes to um, controlling the pollution in our air, or ensuring that, there are better schools in the area where you're living in, right? And so on, right? So I think, thank you, Kabir, Neha, and Yash, and we are happy to take any questions or comments from the
Yeah.
attendees.
So there are a couple of questions. So the way I'm going to do this is actually I'm going to put these two questions together, which are on this topic specifically, and then I might I'll ask some of the students to talk specifically about their sort of studies in public policy at Flame. So we start with these questions over here. The first question that I'd like to put is that how, given the vast diversity, I mean, when you're creating laws for women in the country or directed at women's empowerment, safety, etc., trying to create policies for this, how easy is it, or how much sense does it make to to create laws that apply to women across the country, given the fact that there is massive diversity in this category itself, massive social and economic inequality that will affect how these play out. Because I think, as both students and you had said, Professor Juhi, that there is a big difference in the way that, say, an urban upper class woman is, say, treated, or how her statements are considered at a police station versus say, that of more marginalized groups. So how would you respond to this? Like, how do you create a system, and how easy or difficult is it to create a system that can apply across the country in this way? So any of the
Yes,
students
Neha.
want to start?
I think Neha wants to say something.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting and it's a really good question. It's very valid, and when you hear people from the policy sector talk, or policy field talk, they do highlight this, where yes, you can create laws that say criminalize marital rape, and that applies for everyone irrespective of gender. But when you make policies such as when you had Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, when they came up with their apps for women, it showed how a certain policy could potentially not benefit one type of women, and that was the women who weren't even accessible to smartphones. So yes, should it is difficult to sort of include everyone, but there should be there need to be policies for every inclusive of every single sort of woman. So when you're talking about apps for women that do own smartphones, which you could say is maybe middle class or upper middle class, you also need to technically intervene and put street lights and CCTV cameras in rural areas. So definitely some things cannot be blanket policies. It's because of our diversity and the stratification like within women itself. But you need, when you're making policies, it has to be inclusive, or whether it's 10 policies because you're trying to cater to everything, but it can't just leave out sort of communities and or diverse sort of brackets of women, I'd say.
So let's just put it this way, right? I mean, in certain policies have to be universal, isn't it? Every woman needs to be free from violence and sexual harassment. This is not a debatable topic, right? Every woman. The problem is that, in fact, there is uneven implementation. That's where the problem is. But the policy has to be universal, catering to every woman deserves um, a public space that is free of harassment, right, where she can enjoy herself, and just as a way a young man can enjoy himself. And I think Neha said something very interesting, right, in the sense that your infrastructure can play a big part, whether your streets are lit up, your public toilets are open at all times and they are lit up as well, right, that you are able to access the public space. When I say public space, I don't mean malls or coffee shops, but I mean outside, literally, like your streets, your parks, and so on, your public buses, and so on. It is in these spaces that every woman across class, caste, religion should have access to safety while enjoying her freedom, right? This is not debatable at all. This is, in fact, what we need is to actually reach a place where we can say confidently that this is now there for every woman.
Yash or Kabir, do you have anything to add to this? Or? Okay. Yeah, Kabir, go ahead.
I mean, I guess I completely concur with what Neha is saying, and this brings me, to Tavleen Singh. I mean, some of you may know her. She's an Indian Express. She writes regularly for them. So when the Me Too movement started, and like everybody was talking about their harassers and everything, so she had a particularly vested interest in defending Suhail Seth, who's a friend and everything. But she had a pertinent point to make that time, that in terms of Me Too, it has amplified a lot of women. It has amplified, their voices and a lot of their concerns, but it had left out, and that is what these Me Too women, and she had called them, publicity experts or whatever. She had said that you should really be working towards the grassroots and towards the rural women who have been left out, towards these sort of voice that is needed to be given, this sort of agency in order to be able to accuse your, name your harassers effectively. In that sense, even though there was an infrastructure in place for urban upper class women, not of course all of them, but a major set of them, to be able to voice their opinions, voice their issues, here a major section was left out. So that's what I want to point out, that in a sense, yes, Me Too and other, of course, pertinent examples need to factor in, include, incorporate every particular section of society.
Okay, so the second question here, it's worded a little difficultly, but I'm going to try to. So I think I will try to capture sort of the essence of it, which is that certain laws are written in such ways that they apply restrictively. So they are, described as laws where XYZ action by a man, against a woman or harming a woman. So do guidelines or laws like these? Do they end up being more restrictive, in their scope, because of the potentially affected populations that they exclude as well, who then don't have even legal recourse? So of course it's one thing to say that there is a law in place, but people can't access it. But in this situation, the law itself is, they're written out of the law themselves. So, yeah, Yash, go ahead.
I think the question is a really pertinent one, but I think as far as Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013 was concerned, one of the criticisms that it received from the Justice Verma committee report drafters was that the government kind of framed its language in a very anti-gender neutral way. So it was gender biased, and it explicitly states that the offenses of voyeurism, sexual harassment, and stalking would necessarily apply towards men as perpetrators and women as victims. However, the law has kind of also been lauded for the fact that there has been a lack of misuse of the law in the last 7-8 years that the law has been there for. So yeah, the laws aren't exactly gender neutral, but one could speculate that the reasons why the law was also made the way it was so that certain men who would be in powerful positions don't end up playing this law and subverting with it in a way that kind of uh, bails them out in case they are guilty. So I think the laws are, from that perspective, fair enough. Fair enough.
Any other speakers want to add to that?
I think Yash is covered pretty much.
Can I give
Okay.
some more points here?
So yeah, go on, Kabir.
Yeah, so I mean, I just like to pose a counterpoint over here in the sense that there was Shiny Ahuja's case, which was not talked about and everything. There was even a movie made on it, and there was, I mean, a lot of discussion regarding it. So that posed the question that are sexual harassment laws are, I mean, laws related to rape, in a sense, gender biased, as the question posed by that, I mean, the participant over there, that in a sense gender biased. I mean, of course, it's an anomaly. I mean, it would obviously be an aberration, a small aberration. Shiny Ahuja's case, wherein he was in a relationship with his maid, and in the sense that due to some certain external factors, he was convicted and sent. And later on, it was proven that he was actually in a relationship with his maid, and he spent 9 to 10 years in jail for raping his maid. In that sense, because the onus of proving that he was not raping that girl, that the maid, was on him. So I mean, that posed a very subversion, and I think that was a big fallacy, I would say, in law.
Okay. So just, I mean, we're reaching the end of our session. So just for closing remarks, I want to move away from this particular topic. And for the students specifically over here, I think you've obviously spoken very eloquently about the topic at hand. So, I mean, I want to ask you about how you think your experience at Flame has sort of helped you come to a place where you can, where you can speak with, this amount of authority at the undergraduate level, and this and what your experience of the public policy program at Flame has been like. So Kabir, we can start with you right now.
Right. So of course, I mean, after 12th and I mean 3 years at Flame have obviously played a major impact on my life, and in a sense, and specifically the public policy platform, a public policy program, because there are a lot of presentations and there are a lot of talks involved with regards to public policy, and even with my minor. So in that sense, I have received a lot of feedback, and I've improved on my every presentation, and in the sense that whatever I was deficient in, I built on it, and that way I've been able to incorporate those suggestions and effectively research better, effectively be able to have a sense of command over my language and that.
Neha.
So definitely, I think like Juhi ma'am said, Flame is one of the only, I mean, is the only college that actually gives uh, a public policy as an undergraduate course. And what's nice is that because we get offered minors also, there's a lot that we could sort of apply when it comes to both. So I've taken um public policy and operations, and there's a lot I apply from operations into public policy. I have friends that are doing policy and environmental science, and they want to do um, environmental policy basically. And even though environmental policy is not a like degree that you get, and it's something that you could only do in your masters, Flame sort of offers the combination of both, and when you do it together you sort of get the feel and the depth that you may get like once you do pick a masters of say the exact specialized course. So I think that is one thing that I really like, as well as I think the way that the professors at Flame do teach public policy is extremely discussive, and it's in simulation. So whatever you're learning, whether you're learning about like the legislative process or you're trying to debate bills, it's all done where you're actually given actors in this entire process. So recently we were talking about farm bills, and we were given actual actors that are involved in this entire debate, and we were made to actually think in those aspects. So I think it's very simulating, and It's very informative, and it takes a lot of it's not just theory at all. It's a lot to do with current affairs, and there's a lot we can apply just with the course theory to I'd say like any current affairs situation that is going on, which I personally really like. So
Okay, and Yash?
Yeah, for me, I think public policy has been quite helpful in terms of the breadth that public policy offers at Flame, because we study a variety of disciplines within it. Like, for example, we'd have certain courses in economics, uh, one or two of them in sociology and political science. So uh, these courses help us in understanding the intricacies of policy well, and there is a fusion of like deep academic knowledge along with a lot of class discussions, as Neha said, which really helps us put everything that we are learning in in our course in perspective. So it's not just like, I guess, if uh, we recall the kind of education we had in like our 11th and 12th grade, it was mostly based on rote memorization. One of the perks that Flame offers, at least in its policy department and few non-technical majors, is that leeway in terms of expanding your skill sets, which would usually be in terms of improving your communication skills, and when it comes to working on presentations and writing extensive well researched assignments. So in that sense, public policy at Flame is quite useful. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Yash, and all your students. Now, there's just one final question that's come here, which is about, degree in political science versus public policy. I mean, so Flame doesn't offer political science as an area of specialization. From what I understand, though, political science as a discipline, I mean, there are elements of that that are integrated into the public policy program, and so you'll have courses on political theory, and contemporary politics, and all of that in the policy program. And so the public policy program will give you, I think, a more holistic exposure than just perhaps a narrow political science program. You'll also have economics, some basic economics, and that integrated. And so you're given a much more practical toolkit, I think, at the end of that program to go into, say, the domain of public policy. Whereas I think from what I understand, when you get into masters at the a master's in public policy, a lot of people go with a political science degree. So you go with say a greater theoretical background, and then you gain sort of the more practical understandings of the discipline when you're at the master's level. If there's anything anyone has to add to that, then please do. Otherwise, I
And
think that's
Shantanu, just to add what you have just mentioned about the what all we cover as a public policy when it comes to a major area of specialization, I think we have explicitly given what all courses we offer under public policy
yeah.
with a detailed description of it. Maybe it will be beneficial for the attendees to go and have a look at the website under the undergraduate program. Once is a public policy is a major area. Even if somebody takes public policy as a minor, what all we cover, what courses we teach is being explicitly given in detail. Um, I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, I don't know whether the attendees were there or no, but this was an attempt from the admissions office and from the Flame as a whole for us to showcase that what our public policy students can maybe think up to, or what are the areas we do cover when it comes to public policy as an area of specialization to be offered by Flame. Since we're all of us are working remotely these days, it's not possible for our prospective students to come and meet students like Neha, Kabir, Yash. Wish this interaction personally was possible. But since it's not possible and all of us are working remotely, we just thought to present some certain topics where probably our students can authoritatively speak about it basis on their research and basis on their classroom sessions and basis on whatever complementary other co-curricular and extracurricular activities they have gone through so far. Having said this, maybe Professor Juhi, if you want to add up anything on the closing note, and then I think we are done with the session. So for the attendees, we have some similar sessions coming in from different areas of specializations for you. Maybe in the next a few days or so, we will send you the invite for each of the webinars separately. Please keep in touch with us and have a look at your registered email IDs. Professor Juhi, over to you, maybe in case you want to end up the session on a special note.
Yeah, thank you, Pallavi. Yes, I mean, just to end, I would just like to say one thing, that although public policy is a young discipline, it's a growing discipline, it's a growing field, right? Increasingly, there are so many avenues where you can apply your knowledge of public policy, whether, as I said, it's a think tank or your government, bureaucracy, and even increasingly private companies, big companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, all of them have public policy departments, right? So there's a lot of scope, right, for you to enter into these very exciting fields, right, which require people who have knowledge about public policy. So take a look at our program, right? It's very it includes courses from a variety of fields, which is what is needed in a public policy program: law, sociology, political science, economics, and so on. And at the same time, you take a look at some other programs even offered by American universities, for instance, and you'll see that it's comparable, right? We've looked at programs across the world and designed a program which is catering to Indian students, as well as prepares them for an excellent public policy master's program in the West after they've finished here, right? So yes, good luck, and do reach out if you have any questions.